Thank you very much for being on the programme this evening. Israel is poised to launch a ground offensive in Rafah, and I think approximately half of the entire population of Gaza is seeking refuge in Rafah. How worried are you about the situation?
Very worried. I mean, look, it's absolutely clear that with 1.5 million people asked to move from the north to the south, with people crowded now around Rafah in effectively refugee camps, that were there to be a ground offensive, thousands more people will die. And as we have been saying for weeks, the fighting has to stop. Too many women, children have lost their lives. Innocent people have lost their lives. The fighting has to stop. The hostages have to come out. We're absolutely clear that the only way now that humanitarian aid gets in and the hostages come out is that we need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
Because the wording has changed a bit, right? You're calling for an immediate ceasefire now. You were previously calling for a temporary ceasefire. What is the difference between those two positions?
Well, we have been saying for weeks that the fighting should stop, and we said that weeks ago now.
So why have you changed the
wording?
wording?
Let me just say this, that if you went back to the end of October, when Keir Starmer gave his Chatham House speech, he said then that if the circumstances change on the ground, our position would evolve. It's now day 137. The position has absolutely evolved. Over 29,000 people have lost their lives. And we saw the statement from our closest allies last week, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand. We went to Munich, I went with Keir Starmer, we spoke to European colleagues, we spoke to Antony Blinken. Absolutely clear now that the global community is totally worried at the prospect of a further offensive. But the way now to get those hostages out and the humanitarian aid is that there should be an immediate ceasefire and it should be lasting.
But it's important to say, I do want to come in because, yes, the international community wants the fighting to stop, but there is difference of opinion on how that's done. You know, you mentioned our allies, some of our allies in the Five Eyes, but that is a different position from America. They are not calling for an immediate ceasefire. They vetoed the Algerian resolution at the UN calling for an immediate ceasefire. They want a temporary ceasefire, and it feels like we're dancing on a head of a pin here, but language matters.
I think it's a major...
You think we should go further than what the Americans are calling for and call for an immediate ceasefire?
We believe that the fighting should not resume. We believe that there needs to be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We do not want to see the fighting resume, and therefore we do take a different view to the Americans. But I would say this, it's years since I've seen the Americans strike a completely different position to Israel. So I do think it's significant that overnight the American position has become there needs to be a cessation of that violence and there needs to be a temporary ceasefire. That is a major development in of itself.
You say that you don't want the fighting to resume.
No.
Your motion also calls for the return of the hostages, and it says Israel cannot be expected to cease fighting if Hamas continues with violence. Do you really, hand on heart, believe that if Israel stops fighting, puts down their weapons, then Hamas will cease all violence against Israel?
Well, a ceasefire is, by definition, both sides observing the peace, both sides putting down their arms.
So
that is what our motion calls for.
You believe that Hamas is going to turn into a peace organisation?
I don't believe that Hamas are going to turn into a peace organisation, but let us be clear. We called for a pause back at the end of October. We got that pause, and Hamas observed that pause, as did Israel.
They didn't return all the hostages, did they?
Look, let's be clear. A ceasefire doesn't mean peace. A ceasefire means the violence ends and the political negotiations and the circumstances for peace can begin. That's about hostages, it's about prisoners, it's about Palestinian recognition, it's about two-state, and that is why we have a detailed motion before the House tomorrow that I hope the whole House, Conservative and SNP, can get behind.
Yeah, I want to talk about what's happening in the House as well, but I guess what some supporters of Israel would say is, you know, if you're calling for the fighting to never start again, you're effectively saying Israel stops fighting, allows Hamas to regroup, and you admit yourself you don't believe Hamas is going to turn into a peace organisation. So do you think that because of the loss of life in Gaza, it is worth a ceasefire, even if it effectively benefits Hamas?
What are the circumstances in which those hostages come out? What were the circumstances last time? A ceasefire. What are the
That was a temporary ceasefire.
What are the circumstances?
That was a temporary ceasefire. You're calling for a permanent ceasefire.
We're calling for a permanent ceasefire, that is true. What is the circumstances in which we see an end to a conflict that has actually gone on for 75 years, a political solution, 2 states, Palestinian recognition as a roadmap, and, by the way, Israel meeting the obligations under the ICJ? Those are the things we have been calling for. That gives us a lasting ceasefire. You need the political space for that lasting ceasefire. And at the moment, Arab states, the United States, European others, forming a good contact group to begin the work for that negotiation. That is why we now believe there needs to be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
You're putting forward your amendment for tomorrow in House of Commons, but it is quite likely that it's not going to get called, right? And that the choice that you'll have to vote on is 2 very clear amendments. The SNP amendment, which calls for an immediate ceasefire, prioritising protecting civilian life in Gaza, and the government amendment, which calls for a humanitarian pause with the ambition of a permanent ceasefire. In other words, saying that Israel should have a right to defend itself. If those 2 amendments are on the table and not yours, which will you vote for?
Well, look, the Speaker has yet to determine how he moves forward on the motions before him. Let us wait to see what the Speaker determines. I'm of the view that we don't need a temporary ceasefire, as the government's calling for. I think we need much more than a pause. I think the whole international community is behind the Labour position. And so I don't think that that position is satisfactory, although I have seen David Cameron using the sort of language that Keir Starmer and I have been using for the last few weeks. The SNP motion does not mention 2 states. It does not mention Palestinian recognition. It does not mention the ICJ ruling. It does not mention the diplomatic circumstances that mean we don't get a ceasefire, we get a lasting ceasefire and the fighting doesn't resume. And so I've heard the leader of the SNP today, and the implications are that actually he quite likes the Labour motion. Well, adopt the Labour motion now. Yeah, get behind the Labour motion.
Would you?
The whole House can get behind the Labour motion.
Would you vote for?
And the House of Commons can speak with one voice. Wouldn't that be great?
I get that's what you want. I get you don't think the SNP motion is perfect, but could you hold your nose and vote for it if it is the best thing on the table tomorrow?
I don't want to do anything in an election year in which the Labour Party might have the privilege of serving that cuts across our ability to do that. And if you look at the detail of that SNP motion, it's not balanced. And that is the problem as I see it with the SNP motion.
You talk a lot about a 2-state solution and that Labour wants to see a 2-state solution. Now, forgive me, because I feel like this is a phrase that a lot of people use without really drilling down into what we mean by that. You know, and it can feel like we are further away from a 2-state solution
100%.
than ever, right?
100%.
So who would run Palestine and Gaza in a 2-state solution?
Look, I believe that the Palestinian Authority reformed is important. At the moment, the leader of the Palestinian Authority is effectively 80. There has not been elections either in the West Bank or Gaza now for well over a decade. That is clearly an issue. But the truth is the British Labour Party and the SNP, we're not in the room. We're not in government. Part of those discussions. Those discussions are going on.
It's too difficult to say, isn't it? We haven't got an answer to this question, do we?
It's a hard question. Of course it's a hard question.
But why can you call... It's difficult. Can we really be saying we want a 2-state solution if we can't even lay out the steps? What are the steps we need to get a 2-state solution? The steps that we have certainly suggested that you do need Palestinian recognition. That is a Labour Party position. The government don't seem to agree with us on that. Our view is that you also need to reform the contact group of countries that support the Palestinians and the Israelis to get to this point. I think it's very unlikely that we can leave those two to get there on their own. That is part of the ingredients to it. I disagree with Netanyahu. It has to be 2 states because 1 state is basically you have to guarantee the rights of Palestinian people. I don't believe he really means that. And no state means you continue with occupation, and that is not acceptable or sustainable. So for all of those reasons, the only way to get there is 2 states. It's going to need a lot of heavy lifting.
It's certainly the Saudi Arabians are going to be essential to that if we are to get there. And I've now met with them on many, many occasions to discuss their views. But none of this can happen until there is a ceasefire. Every Arab state will say that to you. Now we've got over 150 members of the UN saying that. We've got our closest allies, Australia, Canada, New Zealand saying that. That is where we are. We need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
OK, thank you very much indeed, David Lammy.